Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. You've been told the story since grade school. The Pilgrims in tall hats, Native Americans in feathered headbands, a shared meal, and a celebration of peace and gratitude. But what if that story is only part of the truth, or worse, a carefully crafted myth? Imagine being one of the last surviving members of a tribe devastated by disease before the Pilgrims even arrived. Imagine the moment two drastically different worlds collided. Not in harmony, but in desperation, survival, and uneasy alliances. This isn't just about a harvest feast. It's about politics, epidemics, power struggles, and the rewriting of history. As cinematic flashes show the contrast, colorful drawings of smiling pilgrims giving thanks fade into stark historical paintings, skeletal remains, colonial documents, and native oral traditions. We hear the chilling voiceover. This is the truth about the first Thanksgiving, what really happened in 1621. It's time to challenge the fairy tale and uncover the complexity of the real events. Keep watching, because this story might just change how you see American history forever. The journey of the Pilgrims in the early 1600s is one of the most iconic stories in early American history, not just for their voyage across the Atlantic, but for what their actions symbolized: a commitment to spiritual conviction, self-governance, and the search for a new way of life rooted in faith. These English separatists, unlike the broader group of Puritans who hoped to reform the Church of England from within, had concluded that the Church was beyond saving. To them, it remained too entangled with Catholic rituals, hierarchy, and state control. They wanted to create a purer, more biblical form of worship, governed by their own interpretations of Scripture, rather than by royal decree or church authorities. Because of this, they faced increasing persecution under the rule of King James. Their meetings were often held in secret, leaders were arrested, families were ostracized. Children grew up in fear of spies and punishment simply for praying in a way that defied the state-sanctioned church. The separatists realized that if they wanted to live according to their beliefs, they would have to leave England entirely. Their first stop wasn't America, but Holland. In 1608, they fled to the more religiously tolerant Netherlands, settling in the city of Leiden. For over a decade, they lived there in relative peace. But it wasn't an ideal solution. Life in Leiden was difficult. The language was foreign, economic opportunities were limited, and the fear that their children would lose their English identity in Dutch society weighed heavily on them. Many still longed for a place where they could build a permanent, self-sufficient community rooted in their values. That longing led them to consider the New World. With backing from English investors, they made plans to establish a colony in North America. Their goal wasn't just to survive, it was to create a holy experiment, a place where their faith could shape every aspect of life, from government to education to social structure. In 1620, around 100 of them boarded a ship called the Mayflower, setting sail into the unknown. Their journey was dangerous, and their arrival was anything but easy. They landed far north of their intended destination, in the harsh and unfamiliar climate of what is now Massachusetts. But they were determined to stay. Before even setting foot on land, they drafted the Mayflower Compact, a remarkable document that established a framework for self-government based on mutual agreement and majority rule. It was one of the first expressions of democratic principles in the New World. Their first winter was brutal. Many died from exposure, illness, and lack of food. But with resilience, the help of indigenous people like Squanto, and a deep belief in their purpose, the survivors slowly built a settlement at Plymouth. The legacy of the Pilgrims is more than just a Thanksgiving story. They helped lay the ideological groundwork for key American values: religious liberty, communal responsibility, and resistance to tyranny. Their journey speaks to the enduring human desire to live with integrity and purpose, even when the cost is exile, suffering, and the unknown. Their journey, both physical and spiritual, was one of extraordinary courage and conviction. Leaving, England had already been a leap of faith, but life in the Netherlands, though more tolerant, posed new challenges. While the Dutch allowed them religious freedom, the separatists struggled to make a living and grew worried their children were losing their English language and customs. They feared that over time, their unique identity and mission would dissolve into the fabric of Dutch society. So they looked westward, to the New World, not just as a place of refuge, but as a blank canvas where they could build a society aligned entirely with their religious ideals. They secured a patent to settle in the northern part of the Virginia colony under English governance and set about organizing the voyage. Financing was secured through English investors who expected the settlers to send back natural resources and goods in return. In September 1620, about 102 passengers, including families, servants, and hired laborers, set sail from Plymouth, England aboard the Mayflower, a small, aging merchant ship more suited for cargo than for carrying people across the Atlantic. The voyage was harsh. Food spoiled, seasickness spread, and violent storms battered the ship. At one point, a main beam cracked and had to be repaired mid-ocean using a large iron screw the settlers had brought along. Still, they pressed on. After 66 days at sea, they finally sighted land. Not the fertile shores of Virginia they had aimed for, but the cold, rocky coastline of Cape Cod, far to the north. Realizing they were outside the bounds of their original charter, they feared disorder and dissent. That's when they took a radical and historic step. They drafted the Mayflower Compact, an agreement to form a self-governing community based on majority rule, mutual consent, and shared responsibility. This compact was groundbreaking, a proto-democratic framework built not by nobles or kings, but by common people. Shortly afterward, they began exploring the region, eventually choosing Plymouth, a former Wampanoag village decimated by a recent epidemic, as the site of their settlement. The land was cleared and there was access to a fresh water source, but winter had already arrived. The months that followed were devastating. Exposure, malnutrition, and disease claimed nearly half the colony. Still, they endured. With help from native allies like Squanto who taught them to plant corn, fish, and navigate the unfamiliar terrain, the survivors managed to plant crops and rebuild. Their arrival on the coast of Massachusetts wasn't the plan, but it became a defining moment in American history. That unintended landing laid the foundation for New England, and their values, community governance, hard work, religious devotion, and moral purpose, would shape the identity of a new nation for centuries to come. They landed in December, far too late to plant crops or build adequate shelter. The land was unfamiliar and cold. There was no one to greet them except the harsh New England winter. Over the next few months, nearly half the settlers perished from exposure, malnutrition, and disease. Their first winter was not marked by celebration or abundance, but by burial after burial. Entire families were wiped out. And yet, in this time of desperation, a fragile thread of hope would soon emerge, not from within their own group, but from the indigenous people who had survived their own tragedy just years earlier. The events that led to the so-called First Thanksgiving were already being shaped long before a turkey was ever roasted. Massasoit recognized that his people, still reeling from the epidemic and facing pressure from rival tribes like the Narragansett to the west, might benefit from a strategic alliance. The Pilgrims, despite their weakness, possessed something valuable: access to European goods, tools, and weaponry. More importantly, they needed the Wampanoag to survive. This imbalance created a mutual, if fragile, dependency. In the spring of 1621, Massasoit sent an emissary, Samoset, a sagamore from a neighboring tribe who had picked up rudimentary English from earlier explorers. Samoset's unexpected arrival shocked the Pilgrims. His first words to them, "Welcome, Englishmen," must have seemed nothing short of miraculous. Not long after, he returned with Tisquantum, better known as Squanto, a Patuxet man who had been kidnapped years earlier, sold into slavery, escaped to England, and eventually returned to his homeland, only to find his village wiped out by disease. Squanto became a vital bridge between the two worlds. He taught the Pilgrims how to plant corn using fish as fertilizer, where to fish, and which native plants were edible. His guidance was instrumental in their survival. That summer, a formal peace treaty was established between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims, pledging mutual protection and non-aggression. Massasoit's gamble had paid off, for a time. The Wampanoag gained a buffer against their enemies, and the Pilgrims gained a lifeline in a land that would have otherwise swallowed them. This cooperation led to the First Thanksgiving later that year, a 3-day feast that, while symbolic, masked the deeper complexities of their relationship. Though This early alliance is often romanticized in American mythology. It was rooted in political necessity and cautious diplomacy. The Wampanoag were not passive participants in a colonial narrative. They were active agents navigating a rapidly shifting world, balancing survival with sovereignty. The seeds of cooperation were genuine, but so too were the undercurrents of future conflict. As more English settlers arrived and expansion intensified, the balance would shift, and the fragile peace would eventually fracture. But in 1621, for a brief moment in time, two very different peoples stood together on the edge of a new world, trying to make it work. The Wampanoag were facing pressure from rival tribes like the Narragansett, who had not been as affected by the recent plague. By forming a strategic alliance with the Pilgrims, who had guns, tools, and the backing of a European empire, Massasoit hoped to strengthen his own position and protect his people. Key to this unlikely diplomacy was a man named Tisquantum, more commonly known as Squanto. His story is extraordinary. Years before, Squanto had been kidnapped by English explorers and sold into slavery in Spain. He eventually made his way to England, learned the language, and later returned to North America, only to find his village decimated by disease. When he encountered the Pilgrims, he became an indispensable interpreter, teacher, and mediator. Squanto taught the settlers how to grow native crops like corn and squash, where to fish, and how to use the land's natural resources. His presence made the alliance between the Pilgrims and Wampanoag possible. It wasn't just a feel-good friendship, it was a delicate political and survival pact, forged in a time of mutual need. In the fall of 1621, after a brutal winter that had claimed nearly half of their numbers, the surviving 50 Pilgrims had managed to produce their first real harvest. It wasn't abundant by modern standards, but it was enough to survive, and that alone was reason to celebrate. So they planned a feast, a kind of English-style harvest festival to give thanks for their survival and the food they'd gathered. Exactly. And this moment, layered with both goodwill and strategic diplomacy, reflects the deeper reality of early colonial encounters. The so-called First Thanksgiving wasn't a simple celebration of unity. It was an event shaped by necessity, politics, and survival. The Pilgrims, having just survived a brutal first year with the help of the Wampanoag, were holding a harvest celebration to give thanks, not only to God, but likely also to their native allies. The sound of gunfire, possibly part of the festivities, may have alarmed nearby Wampanoag, prompting Chief Massasoit to send a sizable group to investigate. That 90 men showed up is significant. It was a display of strength, a way of saying, "We see you, we're watching." Yet when they arrived, things didn't spiral into conflict. Instead, they stayed 3 full days, bringing with them venison and likely participating in a series of shared meals, games, and cautious cultural exchanges. This wasn't a traditional feast by either society's standards. It was more like a diplomatic summit disguised as a harvest party, one that helped cement the fragile alliance between the Wampanoag Confederacy and the Plymouth settlers. The presence of deer, wildfowl, shellfish, corn, and perhaps native squash paints a different picture from the turkey and cranberry version we see today. And this distinction matters. The sanitized, mythologized version of Thanksgiving often erases the complexity of this gathering. It wasn't just a celebration, it was an act of coexistence born of desperation, foresight, and mutual benefit. This event may have been peaceful, but it was also temporary. As more English colonists arrived and territorial demands increased, relations between the Wampanoag and the colonists would deteriorate, culminating decades later in King Philip's War, one of the deadliest conflicts in early American history. So when we think of the first Thanksgiving, it's worth remembering not just the food and the fellowship, but the tension, the diplomacy, and the human stakes that made it possible. As for the food, forget turkey with stuffing, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie. The menu likely included roasted venison, stewed corn and beans, shellfish like mussels and clams, native fruits and nuts, possibly wildfowl, including ducks or geese. There was no sugar for sweet desserts, no ovens for pies, and no white potatoes or cranberries as we know them today. The entire event was less a national holiday and more a cross-cultural harvest meal, spontaneous and practical, meant to mark survival, not historical destiny. And importantly, no one at the time called it Thanksgiving. That term wouldn't be used for this event until centuries later, when a very different narrative began to form. Absolutely. The story of the Pilgrims inviting the Wampanoag out of gratitude is a simplification of a much more nuanced interaction. Historical records do show that the Pilgrims indeed had experienced significant help from the Wampanoag, especially in learning how to grow crops and fish in the New World. However, the idea that the Wampanoag were invited purely out of gratitude is more of a modern mythological spin than what actually transpired. What likely happened was a bit more coincidental and strategic on both sides. The Wampanoag, led by Massasoit, might have heard the gunfire and, curious or cautious, came to investigate. This shows a pragmatic approach from the Wampanoag. They weren't necessarily coming just to join a feast, but to assess whether the Pilgrims were a threat or an opportunity for alliance. Once they arrived, the two groups engaged in a cautious but productive exchange. The Pilgrims offered food, likely part of their Thanksgiving, and the Wampanoag, in turn, brought deer and likely other native foods. While it became a feast, the original purpose wasn't solely to show gratitude. It was more likely a complex mixture of political calculation, survival, and mutual benefit. In sum, the narrative of a cozy, idyllic invitation doesn't reflect the true dynamic at the time, which involved a complex mix of interdependence, diplomacy, and survival. It was, in essence, a mutually beneficial gathering where both sides saw value in cooperation, but the invitation likely wasn't as formal or heartfelt as we've come to imagine. Exactly. The Feast of 1621 in Plymouth was not actually a Thanksgiving by the standards of the time. The term Thanksgiving had a specific religious connotation in Europe and early colonial America. It was usually a day of prayer, fasting, and gratitude, often in response to a specific event like a harvest, a successful journey, or the end of a drought. It was solemn and focused on religious observance. What took place in Plymouth in 1621 was more accurately a harvest festival, where both the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag came together to celebrate a successful harvest and give thanks for the cooperation they had established. It was a communal feast with dancing, games, and a mix of different foods, both European and Native American, which reflected a much more casual atmosphere than what we now consider a formal Thanksgiving. The idea of the first Thanksgiving was actually a later invention, largely shaped in the 19th century, as part of a broader national narrative that sought to unify the growing country during a time of division, such as after the Civil War. As part of this effort, the Feast of 1621 was romanticized and promoted as the beginning of the Thanksgiving tradition to foster a sense of shared heritage and unity, even though it was not called a Thanksgiving at the time and was not the first of its kind. Thus, calling it the first Thanksgiving is an example of how historical events can be reinterpreted to fit the needs of the present. It wasn't a formal holiday, but rather a celebratory moment that would, over time, be woven into a national myth. Myth 3. Harmony and peace lasted between the Pilgrims and natives. The image of enduring friendship after the feast is perhaps the most misleading. While the Wampanoag-Pilgrim alliance did last for a few decades, it was built on fragile mutual needs, not unconditional friendship. As more English settlers arrived, demands for land increased, treaties were broken, and tensions grew. The eventual breakdown led to devastating conflict, King Philip's War in 1675, one of the bloodiest wars per capita in American history. It marked a violent end to whatever peace the 1621 meal had symbolized. So while the 1621 feast did happen, and was a rare moment of cooperation, the story we've long told is more myth than reality. And understanding that helps us better grasp the complex, often painful roots of American history. The first Thanksgiving, as we've come to know it, is often celebrated as a time of harmony and cooperation between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag. However, from an indigenous perspective, this event, and the broader history of colonization, is far more complex and painful. For many Native Americans, Thanksgiving is not a day of celebration, but a day of mourning. It serves as a reminder of the beginning of centuries of loss, violence, and upheaval brought by European settlers. While the feast in 1621 may have been a temporary moment of alliance, the long-term effects of colonization devastated indigenous communities. The legacy of colonization can be felt in the ongoing struggles faced by Native Americans: loss of land, lives, and culture. With the arrival of European settlers, Native communities faced forced displacement, broken treaties, and violent conflict. Over time, many tribes were pushed off their ancestral lands, their resources stripped away, and their populations decimated by disease and warfare. Modern Indigenous voices highlight the continuing effects of this history. For example, Dr. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, a Native historian, emphasizes that the colonization of the Americas was not simply about land acquisition, but about a systemic erasure of Indigenous cultures. She explains that the history of Thanksgiving is part of a larger narrative where Native peoples have been reduced to mere footnotes in the story of American expansion. Another powerful perspective comes from Wampanoag writer and activist Wamsuta, Frank James. He has noted that while some non-Native people view the first Thanksgiving as a moment of cooperation, it marked the beginning of a process of taking our land and trying to take our culture. His statement reflects a sentiment shared by many Indigenous people. The events of 1621 are tied to a longer, painful history of dispossession. For many Native Americans, Thanksgiving is a reminder of the deep wounds of colonization and a time to reflect on the ongoing fight for rights, recognition, and the preservation of culture. Absolutely, and that's a crucial point. Thanksgiving, as it is celebrated today, is rooted in a complex history. While many Americans view it as a time of gratitude and unity, for many Native communities, it represents a period of loss, colonization, and the beginning of centuries-long struggles. The Feast of 1621, although a moment of cooperation, is set against the backdrop of European expansion, which brought disease, displacement, and violence to Indigenous populations. Acknowledging the Indigenous perspective is vital because it helps us understand the long-lasting impact of colonialism on Native communities. The land that was once home to flourishing cultures and civilizations was taken through violence and coercion, and the ensuing policies of forced relocation, assimilation, and suppression continued for generations. For many Indigenous peoples, Thanksgiving is a time of reflection on the resilience of their communities and the continued fight to preserve their culture, land, and rights. Recognizing this history is not about diminishing the importance of Thanksgiving for those who celebrate it, but rather offering a fuller, more inclusive narrative that respects the experiences of Native peoples. By honoring Native history and culture, we not only give respect to their past and present struggles, but we also contribute to a more honest and nuanced understanding of American history as a whole. Incorporating this awareness into our observance of Thanksgiving can open doors to greater understanding and support for the rights and sovereignty of Native nations. It can also help foster meaningful conversations about how we can move forward as a more inclusive society that acknowledges the complexities of the past. Thanksgiving's journey to becoming a national holiday is a fascinating blend of political decisions, cultural shifts, and evolving narratives. Lincoln's decision to declare Thanksgiving a national holiday was deeply symbolic, especially in the midst of the Civil War, a time when the United States was torn apart by division and conflict. His proclamation was not just about giving thanks for blessings, but about reminding the nation of its shared values and fostering a sense of unity in the face of adversity. Lincoln's call for thanksgiving and praise to our beneficent Father reflected a deeply spiritual message, urging the nation to take a moment to reflect on its collective identity, despite the political, cultural, and geographic divides that had created such turmoil. The Union, at that time, was still battling to preserve itself, and the proclamation helped set the tone for rebuilding the nation after the war. By designating the holiday, Lincoln aimed to promote a sense of national unity, helping Americans focus not just on the harsh realities of the war, but also on what united them as a people, namely the desire for peace, prosperity, and the preservation of the nation's core ideals. Interestingly, the declaration of Thanksgiving as a national holiday also had a practical effect. It was part of a broader effort to create a more unified national culture. This was a time when the country was struggling to find a common thread that could bind it together, and Lincoln used Thanksgiving to encourage shared gratitude and reflection, even as the country faced devastating loss and uncertainty. Over time, Thanksgiving, which initially had different regional observances, became firmly rooted as a national tradition, with Lincoln's proclamation marking the start of an enduring cultural and political ritual that, while evolving, still carries significant meaning in American society today. Interestingly, while Thanksgiving had been celebrated in different parts of the country since colonial times, it wasn't until Sarah Josepha Hale, a writer and editor of Godey's Ladies book, started a campaign in the 1840s that it gained traction. Hale, who is also known for writing the nursery rhyme, Mary Had a Little Lamb, had spent years lobbying various U.S. presidents to make Thanksgiving a national holiday. She believed that a unified day of thanks could foster a sense of civic pride and solidarity across the divided nation. Once Lincoln declared it a national holiday, Thanksgiving began to take on more of a unified cultural significance. Over time, the simplified narrative of a peaceful feast between Pilgrims and Native Americans became more prominent in popular depictions. This image was particularly popularized in the 19th and 20th centuries by artists, writers, and marketers. It portrayed an idealized and often inaccurate version of early American history, one that focused on harmony and cooperation, rather than the complexities and tragedies of colonization. This version of Thanksgiving, with turkey, pumpkins, and shared meals, became ingrained in American culture, becoming synonymous with family, generosity, and unity. But it also helped to obscure the deeper and often painful histories of Native Americans and the lasting impact of colonization. As Thanksgiving became an annual tradition celebrated across the United States, it also evolved into a day of commercial and cultural significance marked by family gatherings, parades, and the start of the holiday shopping season with Black Friday. What began as a day of gratitude and reflection transformed into a much more commercialized and simplified version of its historical roots, contributing to the modern understanding of the holiday as a symbol of national unity. Yet, even as the holiday became ingrained in American society, the real complex history of Thanksgiving, with its ties to colonialism, displacement, and the enduring indigenous struggle, remains largely sidelined in mainstream narratives. You're absolutely right. Acknowledging the complex history of Thanksgiving is not just about rewriting the past, but about engaging with it in a way that recognizes both its positive and painful legacies. The idealized version of Thanksgiving, which often focuses on harmony between Pilgrims and Native Americans, has long been used to foster a sense of unity and national pride. However, by ignoring the larger, more painful narrative of colonization, forced displacement, and cultural erasure experienced by indigenous communities, this myth perpetuates a narrow, one-sided view of history. The story of the first Thanksgiving, as it's often told, suggests that the encounter between European settlers and native peoples was peaceful and mutually beneficial. While there was indeed an initial period of cooperation, this narrative leaves out the larger context of violence, broken promises, and the long-term impacts of European colonization on native communities. Over the next few centuries, many indigenous people were forcibly displaced from their lands, subjected to violent conflicts, and experienced devastating population declines due to disease and warfare. By focusing only on the positive aspects of the Thanksgiving story, we risk overlooking the pain and resilience of Native peoples who continue to live with the long-lasting effects of colonization. Indigenous communities are still grappling with historical trauma, loss of land, cultural erasure, and systemic inequalities, issues that often go unaddressed during the holiday celebrations. Honoring the true history of Thanksgiving and giving voice to Indigenous perspectives offers a way to reckon with these uncomfortable truths. It's an opportunity for reflection and growth, fostering understanding and respect for the cultures and communities that have often been marginalized in mainstream narratives. It can also spark important conversations about how we can work together to acknowledge past wrongs and support Indigenous peoples in their efforts to preserve their cultures, revitalize their languages, and address ongoing injustices. Ultimately, a more honest engagement with Thanksgiving allows for a more inclusive national identity, one that recognizes the diversity of experiences that have shaped the United States and the importance of healing and reconciliation. It's about remembering that true unity doesn't come from ignoring the pain of the past, but from acknowledging it and striving to build a more equitable future for all. You're absolutely right. The stories we tell about our past shape the way we view the present and influence how we approach critical issues like race, justice, and inequality. History is not just a collection of facts and events. It is a narrative that forms the foundation of our identity as individuals, communities, and as a nation. the myths we cling to can have a profound impact on how we see ourselves, our values, and even the way we interact with others. When historical narratives are simplified or selectively told, especially to serve patriotic or convenient agendas, we lose sight of the full complexity of the past. These oversimplified stories often ignore the realities of oppression, injustice, and suffering faced by marginalized groups, leading to a skewed or incomplete understanding of history. By ignoring these uncomfortable truths, we risk creating a distorted sense of identity that perpetuates harmful myths and misunderstandings. For example, many of the myths surrounding Thanksgiving and other national holidays create an image of American history that glosses over the devastating impacts of colonization on indigenous communities, as well as the systemic racism that has shaped the experience of Black Americans, immigrants, and other people of color. When these realities are ignored or minimized, it reinforces the notion of American exceptionalism, a narrative that suggests the U.S. is somehow immune to the flaws and failures of other nations. This can have tangible effects on public discourse, policy debates, and national priorities. For example, when historical inequality is denied or minimized, it becomes harder to address systemic racism, economic inequality, and other injustices that persist today. Reconciliation and healing can only occur when we acknowledge the full scope of history, including its darker chapters. Recognizing the uncomfortable parts of history isn't just about dwelling on the past. It's about learning from it so that we can build a more just and equitable future. It opens the door to meaningful dialogue, growth, and understanding, allowing us to recognize the human impact of the policies and decisions made by past generations. These conversations may be difficult, but they are necessary if we are to create a society that truly values justice, inclusivity, and healing. The myths we hold onto can provide comfort or a sense of unity, but when we examine them critically, we can identify where they fall short and how they perpetuate harm. This critical reflection allows us to reclaim the narrative, not as a way to erase or rewrite the past, but to acknowledge the full complexity of history and its ongoing effects on our society. Ultimately, embracing a more honest view of history opens up possibilities for shared understanding and growth. It invites us to redefine what it means to be American, not by ignoring the divisions of the past, but by confronting them with the hope of forging a more inclusive and compassionate future. Truth matters, and history is rarely one-dimensional. By embracing the full story of Thanksgiving, including the perspectives of Native Americans and the consequences of colonization, we can create a more inclusive and thoughtful celebration. This doesn't mean abandoning the holiday or rejecting its place in American tradition. It means expanding the conversation to be more inclusive and educational. Instead of perpetuating myths, we can use Thanksgiving as an opportunity to reflect on how far we've come as a nation and how much further we need to go in acknowledging and addressing the harm done to Indigenous communities. It can be a moment to teach future generations about the complexities of history, honoring the diverse voices that have shaped the country, and fostering a deeper understanding of the past. For many Native Americans, Thanksgiving can be a day of mourning rather than celebration, a reminder of the profound loss they endured. Listening to their voices, learning about their histories, and understanding the impact of colonization can help create more respectful dialogue and encourage healing. By celebrating with awareness, we can honor all aspects of the holiday, from gratitude and unity to the need for continued justice and respect for Indigenous communities. In the end, a thoughtful celebration of Thanksgiving, grounded in education and reflection, can make the day more meaningful for everyone, recognizing the sacrifices and resilience of Native peoples while also cherishing the shared experiences and connections that bind us together as a nation. Now that you've learned the true story behind Thanksgiving, what do you think about it? Do you think we should continue to celebrate the holiday the way we have? Or is it time to rethink how we observe it? I'd love to hear your thoughts and engage in a respectful discussion down in the comments below. Encourage engagement. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to hit that like button and share it with friends and family to help spread awareness. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on more deep dives into history. We have so many more stories to uncover. Tease next video. Next time, we'll uncover the real story behind Pocahontas. It's not the fairy tale you might remember. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. Final reminder. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.